my name's Jared, and I'm here to talk about JavaScript, what could have been. So, who here hated history in high school? A couple more than you than that. Either you had very good teachers, or I went to a crappy high school. It wasn't until I hit uni that history sort of started coming alive to me, mainly because it was fairly violent. I mean, the Trojan horse is a good example of this. I know it's not real history, but still. So, the Smithsonian has recently started trying to get people interested in history. Have any of you seen these ads? It says 50 Cent got shot and still whines about it on stage. Teddy Roosevelt got shot mid-speech and didn't leave the stage until he finished. Ozzy Osbourne's dirty language rubbed off on his kids. Andrew Jackson was so vulgar his parrot was ejected for swearing at his funeral. Bret Michaels got with every chick on the love bus. Genghis Khan got with so many chicks there's a 5% chance that you're related to him. So hopefully I've got you excited about history. So we're going to take a step back in history. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Well, that's probably a bit too far back. We probably need a computer to be invented for it to be relevant to this conference. In the beginning, Brendan Eich created the JavaScript. Now the JavaScript was formless. It was spread. Small talk was spread throughout the computer science community. The spirit of self was hovering amongst them, and Java had just been created. Actually, you've all heard that story 1,000 times before. You're at a JavaScript conference. So, what if? How many of you asked the question, what if? Like, what would happen if a raptor walked through that door? We'd probably be all screwed since it's only one way out. Windows, but you never know. So what if Cleopatra had been ugly? Would we all be living in cities like this because she hadn't led to the downfall of Rome? What if Steve Jobs never took acid? Would it be such an iconic company? Would all the hipsters be using PCs instead of Macs? But here's the thing about history. It's all well and good to look back at the past and say, well, you know, what if that happened? But hindsight's always 20/20. This is a photo of the Brisbane River. Just keep that in mind. So a bit of history on myself. For a year and a half, I was one of 2 JavaScript developers in a company of 200 Java developers. So I often saw this image get passed around to me. We've all laughed at it. I ended up starting to retort with this: effective Java. We need a book to be good. You guys need an 800-page book just to be effective with your language. But this gets me thinking, what is it about Java developers that are so violently defensive of their language, yet JavaScript developers we can generally tell you what our favorite misfeature is. I mean, Douglas Crockford's books is full of it. You know, we all have our favorite misfeature, things like automatic semicolon insertion, type coercion, things like that. When you ask a Java developer what their least favorite thing about the language, they often stare at you blankly, like, it's perfect, what are you talking about? And yet, who here is a Java developer by any chance? What do you think of the language? So this is that's because you're at a JavaScript conference. You've obviously seen the light. I often adamantly have to defend JavaScript to people, like, you know, it doesn't have any typing, it doesn't do this, it do this. Like, you guys don't actually have first-class functions yet. And you spend so much time writing things to get around this. Like, Google's like sort of semi-functional library for Java has an interface called function, which returns a function. It makes no sense. But why is it that Java can do that? Java defends it despite all this, and JavaScript, we sort of let people attack our language every day. And I think it is simply because as a Java developer, they knew what it was like. They came from languages like COBOL. So I'm going to try and install in you the hindsight. This is the Brisbane River after the Brisbane floods. I bet you they thought that building on the edge of a river wasn't such a good idea now. So I'm going to try and give you that hindsight today. So what would have happened if Brendan Eich hadn't slept with his copy of Structure Interpretation of Computer Programs? What would have happened if back in 1995, Microsoft hadn't decided to ignore the web and actually decided to embrace it and not release IE4, 5, and 6? So let's take a step back into a new reality. We're going to take a step back to 1995 and see what would have happened if someone like Microsoft would have created JavaScript from the popular languages at the time. So what was popular in 1995? COBOL? As you all know, COBOL is responsible for the famous Y2K incident, where we all ended up living in vaults like this. It's my own reality. I can say that that actually happened. So we can probably safely say that COBOL was on its way out by now. This book was released in 1994. That means it's nearly old enough to drink in nearly every country in the world except for the US. Does that make you feel old? It certainly made me feel old when I looked it up. But this book is all about object-oriented patterns, so I think it's fairly safe to say that the object-oriented thing was well on its way up. And for better or for worse, the seminal object-oriented language at the time was JavaScript, C++. So C++, it's an iteration on C. Obviously, that's the joke there. It's object-oriented. It has no garbage collection and templates. Any C++ developer will tell you how much they hate templates. This is generally what C++ looks like. Well, this is actually a fairly good example of C++. This is the code for query selector all from WebKit. They've done a fantastic job of maintaining their code base, but generally C++ ends up looking something like this. This is the code from the standard templating library's pushback for vectors. So it's not like I just pulled it from the most horrific piece of code I can find. This is in use every day. And I can't really read it. I hope you can. Garbage collection. So this is 1995. Garbage collection is a fairly new thing. C++ certainly doesn't have a garbage collection. So if we're going to create a language, garbage collection is probably out. So how do we manage our memory? Well, C++ does it through two keywords, new and delete. Just like in JavaScript, new creates a new object. It sort of says, I have an object, it's this size, I need someone to put it. The operating system will go, okay, here's a chunk of memory from the heap, right to here, which is all well and good. So we use that object, but we have no garbage collection. So when we're done with it, we actually explicitly have to say, I'm done, take it away from me. Operating system goes, okay, frees up that piece of memory and then tells the rest of the applications that you can now write here as well. So this comes with a whole range of problems. This piece of code has a subtle bug in it. Does anyone know what it is? Say? Maybe. Is that better? Does anyone know? Yeah. So we allocate a new array of size 42. We then we loop through it, push a bunch of stuff onto it, and then we delete the items. But this is actually leaking memory. Because we're allocating 42 new strings and pushing them onto the array has no idea who owns those objects. It sort of says, I know I've got memory allocated to me, but you might not have finished with it, so I can't delete it. So when you delete items, it just simply removes that initial pointer. So we've just leaked 42 strings. And that's the things that C++ developers have to deal with. Oops. So since we're running backwards in time, we may as well go to the next popular language around in 1985, C. Uh-oh. It's basically a DSL for assembler. It's as low a level as you can get. C-like syntax, obviously. So in JavaScript, a piece of feature detection generally looks something like this. This is from Modernizer. We exploit type coercion. Type coercion is one of those things that everybody uses in every single piece of code base, yet every single person who writes a blog complains about it. I don't know. So here we're just sort of coercing the fact that an undefined can become a Boolean and returning that as an object. But this is witchcraft, basically, in the C world. C has the concept of macros, and not the good kind from Lisp. Macros basically is a pre-pass of the source code before it hits the compiler. You define a token. The compiler can also define a bunch of tokens for you. And this is what we're going to use for feature detection in our language. So this is how it's done now. Sorry about the escaping. CodeMirror did some weird things, and I couldn't fix it. I knew better to touch my slides 10 minutes before the start. So we're creating a new element, we're creating a new div, and then we attach an event to it. But this isn't done at runtime. This is done on build. So if it was running on Firefox, Firefox would see this, and IE would see that, which you may think looks OK. And there's no problem with that. It's workable. But it can introduce some subtle bugs as well. So we do find a variable called 100. I'll increase the code size. And then in the Mozilla block of code, because we're looking at the code, we'll see a variable called a. Then we look at and someone comes along and goes, well, I need to say, let's increase the padding on this element for Mozilla. So they whack in another if defined, and then use a. But this has now introduced a bug into our code because it's not actually defined for Mozilla. So it becomes a maintenance nightmare. On the subject of events, obviously the web is an evented system. It's quite obvious. We click something, we wait for a user interaction, and we do this. So if Microsoft was creating this language, they'd obviously know that we need to run events somehow. So if you take a look around in 1995 and see how other languages were doing events, Win32 is the obvious thing to look at here because it's the same sort of thing. We wait for a user interaction, click a button, do this, do that. So how does Win32 do it? To avoid confusing, I'm going to explain it how C does it natively rather than trying to confuse you. So this is the stack. We've got two pieces of data. They look identical. This one's A, this one's 65. They're exactly the same piece of data, so how is that possible? Using a thing called pointers, it sort of says there's a piece of memory on the stack. It contains some sort of data. When we pull it out, I want you to interpret it as a character, or in the case of the bottom one, I want you to interpret it as an int. So you can get the same piece of memory can return two very different results. So pointers point to an address of memory, and it's up to us on how we deal with it. Hard to follow most of the time. We've got to reference them and dereference them, otherwise you end up dealing with the address, not the data. Ugly syntax uses the star symbol. Function pointers. It's the same sort of thing. Functions are created on the stack, and all we're doing is we're going to use the star syntax to say, there's a function that sits here. When you run, execute that function. And here's a simple example in C. So we've got the main, and then we've got results. And at the top there is how you define a function pointer, the int. That int bracket star callback star int. So that says I'm a function that takes an int, and then I return an int. They're quite hard to read, quite hard to use, and introduce a lot of fun problems. So what have I just said? If any of that went over your head, good. That's kind of my point. These are the things that we as JavaScript developers take for granted every single day. We don't have to know any of this. It's all taken care of us by our interpreters. So the guys at V8 and Mozilla take care of this for us. We don't need to know about memory allocation. Well, unless, of course, you're using host objects in native objects inside IE6, and that's a whole different can of worms. So yeah. And then, so we've got our way to deal with feature detection. We've got a way to deal with events. We've got a way to create objects. But we don't have the rest of our syntax. So VB is the big beginner's language. We want the web to be accessible to new programmers. So we're going to steal the syntax from VB. Built for easy development of GUIs. That's what we want. It's very basic object-oriented image. Some typing through the dim keyword. So this is VBA. It's a dialect of Visual Basic for working with framed applications, things like Access, Excel, things like that. And it looks fairly similar to what we do day to day. We create a connection to a database, a form, a document, the same sort of thing that we do. So it makes perfect sense that this language, we should use this language for syntax. So we're going to steal dim, typing, if then, and anything else that's not to do with objects or events from Visual Basic. And so this is what the language could have looked like had Microsoft developed it. This is a fairly simple event system that we write a lot in JavaScript. And look how much syntax there is just to create an event. And this doesn't even have the trigger, it just simply has the adding. So we've got no hash tables, so we can't do things like, we have to loop through arrays to see if there's a unique thing there. All in all, not very pretty. So do you feel lucky yet? I mean, it could have been much worse. Sure, JavaScript isn't perfect, but a lot of the things that we take for granted day to day, and the things that we complain about day to day, are actually were fairly rare for a language from 1995. So we as the JavaScript community should start playing up to this luck. And just to prove a point, here's the same piece of code in JavaScript. Much cleaner, much easier to read. So, to me, it feels like there are already people who are playing up who take advantage of this lock that I think we have. And jQuery, whatever you feel about the language personally, you can't admit that it brought a whole new world of JavaScript developers to the JavaScript community. It took away what every JavaScript developer dreaded, and that was working with the inconsistencies in the DOM. And here's what jQuery would look like if we had to write it in this language. And it introduces so this here, the 13 lines of code introduces a memory leak. We have to declare our function before we use it. Even though it's a simple one-line function, we can't use an anonymous function. We have to declare our type of callback before we can use it. Ugly. And then we introduce a memory leak here because we still have a piece of reference to the old jQuery and then we override it. I wouldn't want to support this code. So Node.js, it's a few years old now. Do you think Node.js would have been as popular as it was if it hadn't been written on JavaScript? Well, I have the answer for that. Node.js is written on an invented library from C called libev, and here's an example of a socket server written in libev. Would you have come to a libev conference? libev conference? No, probably not, because they don't exist. Would there have been a thing like libev knockout? No, because there isn't. And libev was first written in 2000. So the JavaScript community is hugely lucky that we have. And the thing that enables this is the fact that JavaScript was written the way it was. And that's the same piece of code written in Node. Sure, there's an abstraction layer in between, but the fact that no one came up with this abstraction layer says something to me. Says that we as the JavaScript community are very lucky. So I want you to defend JavaScript. There are things like Java developers who feel the need to write GWT so they don't actually have to learn JavaScript. So why do we do things to try and avoid writing JavaScript? We should embrace the luck that we've been given by Brendan and work from there. This is the pseudo formation from the Roman times. It was hugely successful. It devastated most of the armies that they encountered. And as you can see, they basically just walked arms interlocked, shields interlocked, straight up to the enemy. A well-trained unit was actually so strong that they could put them into a ravine and have horses ride over the top of them. So this is what I want from the JavaScript community. I want us to start walking in the same steps, walking in the same direction, so that we can become as strong as this formation. So how can we do that? Community. JavaScript has a community like no other. I'm fairly active in, let's say, the Python community, and it's nothing like the JavaScript community. I've never seen people who are so friendly. We need to keep this up, so you need to contribute to the community. Next year, you need to flood Jan's email with talk submissions. You need to flood Chris's email with talk submissions for JSConfEU. If your city has a JavaScript user group, attend, speak. If it doesn't, start one. We started CJS about a year ago now, and it regularly gets about 150 people in. And it's growing every day. So contribute to documentation. The way for new people to get involved in the community is through documentation. Contribute to things like HTML5, rocks, see Jan if you want to. And MDN as well. There's a doc sprint happening downstairs. Go contribute, go harass them and ask how you can contribute to the documentation to make the new people in the JavaScript community welcome and avoid W3 school. How many here of you use open source projects? Good, everywhere, single hands here. How many people here have complained about an open source project? Every single hand should be up as well. So instead of complaining, why aren't you creating pull requests on GitHub or Bitbucket? Start by contributing back to the open source communities. Instead of complaining and showing weakness in our armor, we need to start, you have a feature you want, add it. You have documentation you think's lacking, fix it. And join their community. Jump on IRC. Every little bit you can. But most of all, I need you to go forward and be awesome with JavaScript. So who am I? Blah, 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 blah. And you might be asking yourself, who is this guy? Why is he standing in front of me telling me to go do stuff that I've never seen him do? And you're correct. I've been so busy with work, well, at least that's my excuse, that I haven't stepped forward and actually contributed to the JavaScript community with some bit, unless you're in Sydney. And there's slides missing there. It does say, but I am but one man. So I couldn't, in good faith, stand in front of you today and request all this from you if I wasn't willing to step up and do it for myself. So I recently lost a fair bit of weight, which I hope you can tell from that image. It was fucking hard work, I'll tell you that. And I couldn't have done it without the pressure that my friends and my family put on me to keep it up. So I'm going to stand in front of you today and ask for peer pressure. If within 2 months you haven't seen me contribute to a blog, you haven't seen me contribute to an open source project, you haven't seen me contribute to documentation, use those contact details previously and harass me. Harass me until it's... And I'm going to ask you as well that each of you turn to the person next to you and ask them to push you to be awesome as well. Any means necessary. Use a stick to beat them. Figure out what projects they're working on at work that could be open sourced. If they've been talking about fixing some bug in an open source language, open source project, then push them. Make them do it. We need to embrace the luck that we've been given. We need to just basically be awesome so that we as a JavaScript community look as strong as we are. Thank you.